Hello Internet, my name is Tesler-Mabé, and today I'm going to give you a brief history of a few of the most famous guitar amps of all time. These are all amp names you've likely heard before. You've maybe even played them before, you might even own one of the amps on this list. But in this video, I'm going to make sure you truly know and understand what makes each of these amps different and an iconic part of music history. Some of these amps are so iconic that the name of them or just the visual is identifiable even to people who don't play guitar. They're just staples of pop culture. So in this video, I'm going to be using the IK Multimedia TONEX plug to really show off how each of these amps sound, because just giving an explanation isn't enough. And this little thing honestly has some of the best amp simulation tones I've ever heard. The amp impulse response and recreation of not only the amp's tones, but how it sounds and feels acoustically in the room is seriously among the best I've heard from any modeling technology I've tried yet. If you want to try out one of these bad boys and support the channel, you can click the link down below to order one for yourself. You'll be able to recreate any of the sounds you hear in this video, and you'll be able to do it on the go. All you have to do is plug in some headphones, plug the device into your guitar. You could use it as an interface. It's so convenient. So without further ado, let's get into the amps. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, music started getting louder than it ever had been before. One of the most iconic and influential guitar amps of all time was originally created as a bass amp. But Fender quickly realized how this amp solved a key issue for bassists and guitarists. In 1951, Leo Fender designed and began selling the first successful mass-produced electric bass, the Fender Precision Bass. To accompany this, a year later, the Fender Bassman hit the market. At this point in time, guitar amps were still small and underpowered. Fender's earliest guitar amps couldn't handle the low frequencies required for proper bass amplification. Ironically, the Bassman also provided the presence and power electric guitarists were seeking to compete with the volume of the rest of the band. Fender very quickly noticed how eagerly this amp was being adopted by electric bassists and guitarists alike, and in the years to come, later iterations of this amp were better and specifically equipped to handle the needs of both instruments. Earliest iterations of the Bassman commonly used a 15-inch Jensen speaker, which was the largest speaker commonly in use at the time. However, this speaker's large cone was prone to flubbing out when hit hard with certain bass frequencies. So after a few years of experimenting with different formats, Fender realized that the way to more power and volume would be to divide the load between 4 smaller speakers instead of just one big speaker. This new approach stressed each of the individual speakers less and was therefore able to achieve a much louder volume without the sound falling apart on a tonal level. This meant that even at a high volume, the amp would remain clear and have a tighter bass response than what was already on the market at the time. At its core, the Bassman was powerful because it combined higher wattage and a large multi-speaker cabinet at a time when most amps were small and underpowered. The Fender Bassman was instrumental in the birth of amplified rhythm sections. This was Fender learning how to make loud and powerful amps, which lay the foundation for everything music was to become. Now that Fender had created an amp with size and power, the Princeton, specifically the 1965 Princeton Reverb, is when they perfected the professional studio amp. Not everyone played big stages. Some guitarists needed amps for home and studio use. The Fender Princeton was introduced in 1946 and widely produced as a practice amp in 1948. It was practical, but incredibly small and limited in function, tonal range, and power. Throughout the 50s, the design of the Fender Princeton was refined, but they still were primarily regarded as just practice amps. They had limited headroom, no reverb, and overall had very limited tonal range beyond a boxy sound that wasn't ideal for recording, and they simply didn't have the power to be used for performing yet. In 1961, the Princeton underwent an enormous makeover. Instead of a single tube, these amps were built with two 6v6 tubes for more power. The preamp was upgraded to a 12AX7 dual triode circuit with a proper split-load phase inverter, which gave the amp a cleaner signal and smoother breakup. Simply put, this amp just sounded better. This dual triode circuit also finally had the iconic built-in tremolo oscillator that these amps became famous for. While Fender amps across a variety of their models were starting to be built with separate normal and vibrato channels by the mid-50s, until standardizing the dual triode tremolo oscillator across all of their amps, the specific tremolo sound varied significantly across various amp models and didn't yet have that specific, defined, uniform tremolo sound that we now associate with Fender amps. The final monumental upgrade happened in 1964, which is when the Princeton single tone control was replaced with individual bass and treble control knobs. This bass Princeton model was then joined by its sister model, the Princeton Reverb, which had all the same trappings but also had Fender's famous spring reverb on board. The Princeton was standardized and arguably perfected and widely distributed in 1965, which is why this is the year that is most famously associated with these amps. Additionally, the Columbia Broadcast System took over ownership of Fender in 1965. CBS-era changes to the circuit design marked a noticeable change in many of Fender's guitars and amps, which is why 1965 is often looked at as a historical cutoff point for a lot of Fender products. By 1965, the Princeton was perfect for the studio or the home, and now it wasn't a compromise. This amp was no longer just a toy or a gimmick, it was finally a proper professional studio amp. Between the enormous Fender Bassman and highly portable Fender Princeton, Fender needed to create an amp that could work anywhere. Something perfect for the working musician, an amp that had the power to be used on smaller stages, and it had the tonal range and portability to be used in the studio. A perfect jack of all trades. This amp was the Deluxe. To compare the Princeton and the Deluxe, the Princeton had limited headroom due to its smaller 10-inch speaker, compact cabinet, and lighter output and power transformers, causing it to break up quickly. The Deluxe, by contrast, used a larger cabinet with a 12-inch speaker and substantially bigger transformers, giving it more clean headroom, stronger low end, and a louder clean sound. After changes to the circuitry and cosmetics over the course of the 50s, in 1963, Fender began producing a spin-off model of the Deluxe that included an integrated spring reverb tank, thus giving birth to the Fender Deluxe Reverb. Fender discontinued the base Deluxe model in 1966, and just like with the Princeton Reverb, the Deluxe Reverb is most famously associated with the year 1965. That year marks the peak, fully matured version of this era of the Deluxe Reverb design, right before Fender underwent major circuit and ownership changes in the CBS era. In 1952, Fender created an amp that addressed an issue that no other amp could: Could you create an extremely powerful and loud amp that would stay clean even when pushed to its limits? At this point, all other amps, even the mighty Bassman, would break up at a certain point. You could hear the strain that was being put on an amp when it was pushed too far, which was, of course, part of the appeal for many early 50s guitarists as rock and roll was coming into existence. But while music was getting larger and bands were playing at larger venues, that didn't always mean that music was getting heavier, especially in a time when PA systems weren't able to keep up with the new needs of bands. This made it especially important to offer an amp that could do this. The original Twin had dual 12-inch speakers and two 6L6 tubes for a rated output of 25 watts. This was essentially on footing with the Bassman at this point in the early 50s, which had a single 15-inch speaker and two 6L6 tubes for an equally rated output wattage. In essence, these amps were equally powerful, just voiced and packaged differently. Remember, the Bassman was primarily designed for bassists at this point, of course. It had smaller, lighter transformers that were designed to saturate sooner and compress more at the low end. However, from the Twin's inception, it was built with larger power and output transformers that would saturate less even as the volume increased. Another key difference was that the Twin had a larger cabinet, so despite the two amps having a similar tube count and rated wattage, the Twin simply sounded louder and cleaner and more controlled than the Bassman. The divergence between the design of these amps would increase in the later 50s. In 1957, the Twin was modified for more volume, switching from two 6L6 tubes to four 5881 power tubes. Now the amp was able to output dramatically more wattage, making it indisputably huger and louder than any other amp on the market at the time. You'll often see this era of the Twin quoted at around 80 watts, but many historians believe early high-powered Twins were probably closer to 60 to 70 watts in real-world use. Either way, really loud. After undergoing various other cosmetic and electronic changes over the years, the evolution of the Fender Twin into the Fender Twin Reverb happened in 1963. And just like the other Fender amps mentioned in this video, 1965 represented the year that this era of the Fender Twin Reverb was perfected before undergoing all of the changes that were to come in the CBS era. Britain got to the whole rock and roll thing a little later than the US did. Until 1957, very restrictive musician union regulations made touring in Britain very tough for US artists. But that all changed when these restrictions were eased, which enabled a major influx of US touring artists. Now that the mythology of early rock and roll music had properly reached the UK, the British scene began developing its own sound, which incorporated the folk blues sounds of skiffle. A major factor in the UK music scene developing its own sound was the equipment that would give their music a different identity. The Vox AC15 first hit the market in early 1958, immediately grabbing attention on the local scene. But it would be a few years more before this amp circuit would become the iconic AC15 circuit we know today and reach legendary status. It was initially conceived as a clean, reliable stage and dance band amp for the British market. In its earliest iteration, the AC15 could be compared most closely to the early 50s Fender Deluxe, the most notable difference being the use of different output tubes. Instead of using the 6v6 tubes that were so intrinsic to the warmer and rounder tonal character of Fender, Vox used EL84 output tubes that gave their amp a brighter, punchier, more chimey top end. So while the AC15 clearly showed Fender influence, it wasn't just a copy. It was a reinterpretation that set the stage for the sound of the British invasion to come. At its creation, the AC15 was made for a music scene where guitarists were overall looking for clarity and volume, and so the 15-watt AC15 was more than enough for the small clubs and halls where live shows were happening. It wasn't until the very end of 1959 and throughout the following year that the classic AC15 circuit as we know it today would emerge, intended to be an even stronger, clearer, and more reliable amp. But as music rounded the corner into the 60s and the British rock scene began to blossom, guitarists started turning their amps up louder and pushing their equipment even harder. While it wasn't the original intention of the amp, guitarists quickly realized that a cranked AC15 had a uniquely rich sound when broken up. Moving on to arguably Vox's most famous amp, the AC30, this amp was conceived as a scaled-up AC15. It was created in 1959 as an answer to the powerful Fender Twin, a request that came specifically from the iconic British rock group The Shadows to create a Vox amp with even more power. With a very similar design philosophy, early iterations of the AC30 used a lot of the same preamp architecture and retained the AC15's output design and operating approach. But the AC30 was expanded to deliver more volume. The AC30 had double the output power, utilizing 4 EL84 output tubes instead of the 2 found in the AC15, along with larger transformers and a dual speaker cabinet. From their introduction, the AC15 and AC30 were distinguished by both output and format, with the AC15 delivering roughly 15 watts through a single 12-inch speaker, and the AC30 doubling both power and speakers to 30 watts and a 2x12-inch speaker layout. A major design shift came in the early 1960s to meet the needs of louder professional use. The core circuit was simplified to better withstand sustained high-volume operation, while an increased emphasis on mid-range clarity helped guitarists cut through increasingly loud bands. Simpler electronics also made the amp more tolerant of the wears and tears of touring, and less dependent on the intricate circuitry that could be difficult to service on the road. With the AC30 now able to be pushed harder without falling apart, Vox made the top boost channel standard in 1963, further adapting the amp to the higher volumes and larger stages that guitarists were encountering as rock and roll fully took hold. Marshall, as a company, was founded in London in 1962. Its earliest amp, the JTM-45, was heavily modeled after the Fender Bassman, but built with British source components and voiced with a more aggressive mid-range. In 1966, Marshall released the amp that would define the brand and rock music as a whole, the 100-watt 1959 Super Lead. This amp was famously called the Marshall Plexi after the plexiglass control plates found on early models. This was Marshall's first 100-watt amplifier, developed at the request of The Who's Pete Townsend, who needed an amp capable of delivering far more volume than the JTM-45. As an aside, when people refer to the Marshall Plexi, they're most likely talking about the 100-watt 1959 Super Lead, which is the amp that really defined Marshall. But the term Marshall Plexi could also be referring to the 50-watt 1987 Super Lead that came out the same year in 1966 as a lower-powered companion to the 1959. Soon after its release, Marshall made changes to make the 1959 even louder, dirtier, and bolder sounding by incorporating a new transformer and switching to EL34 power tubes. It wasn't until 1967 that the 1959 Super Lead was properly recognized in the Marshall catalog. While Marshall's distributor Rose Morris wasn't initially impressed by the amp, Pete Townsend, Jimi Hendrix, and Eric Clapton were immediate fans and had already given the amp so much exposure they were struggling to keep up with the demand. This amp is also responsible for what became the famous Marshall stack, which was initially an 8x12-inch speaker cabinet that was too cumbersome and heavy for practical use. This was then quickly replaced with a pair of smaller 4x12 speaker cabinets, a 1960A angled cabinet on top of a 1960B box cabinet below, so a guitarist could choose to use only a single cab to create a half stack, or for maximum power, use both cabs for a full stack. In late 1975, Marshall introduced the Master Volume series. They were among the first widely adopted amps to feature both a pre-gain control and a master volume control. This changed the game as music got heavier, because now players could get an overdriven, distorted tone without cranking the amp to stadium levels. Instead of breakup happening primarily at the end of the circuit due to a cranked amp hitting its ceiling, Marshall designers now connected the two input stages on the amp in series instead of in parallel. Now a guitar signal could be broken up at the start of the circuit, and the second volume control that would otherwise be made obsolete by this new wiring was instead converted to a master volume placed after the preamp section. Players could now run high preamp gain and low volume to get tighter, more compressed, more aggressive tone. In late 1975, Marshall introduced the 100-watt JMP 2203, the master volume version of the 100-watt 1959 Super Lead. I know, these names are so confusing, but just bear with me. The 50-watt counterpart, the JMP 2204, based on the 50-watt 1987 Super Lead, came out in 1976. The JMP Master Volume series serves as the direct bridge between the 60s Plexi era and the 80s JCM 800 era. Early JCM 800 models were essentially refined JMP Master Volume amps under a new name, carrying forward the same core circuit architecture with updated cosmetics and minor refinements, thus cementing the JMP Master Volume era as the foundation of Marshall's modern sound. Alright, we covered 8 legendary amps today, which I hope demystified what makes each of these amps so special. It's one of my favorite feelings in the world to help people have those light bulb moments where you finally understand a music concept that you've probably heard thrown around before, but maybe haven't totally known exactly what it meant. So I wanted to make a video to do just that. Hitting 2 birdies with 1 stony, I also wanted to make this video to show off a piece of gear that I've been loving lately. I never show off gear if I don't genuinely love it, even if it's a sponsored video. And I promise you, you'll always know if a video is sponsored. So thank you so much to IK Multimedia for supporting this video. And if you want to get tens of thousands of dollars worth of legendary amps in a small device that costs heck of a lot less than that, and if you want to support the channel, you can head to the link down below to order a TONEX plug of your own. And as always, if you like this video, please refrain from subscribing because I am trying to become the least subscribed person on YouTube. Thank you so much. Bye.